The wind whispered across the open plains, carrying with it the weight of secrets that only the Old West could bear. In the distance, a modest ranch fought against the unforgiving land, where drought, hardship, and poverty left scars deeper than any outlaw's bullet. At the heart of this ranch was a young woman, the daughter of a struggling rancher, who bore the burden of her family's survival upon her fragile shoulders. She had dreams as wide as the horizon, but each day those dreams were chained tighter by hunger, debt, and the merciless judgment of a world that gave no mercy to the weak. Her father, once proud and strong, now wrestled with choices no man should ever face. The ranch was dying, the cattle dwindling, and the creditors circling like vultures in the scorching sun. Desperation forced him into a decision that would alter the course of his daughter's life forever. To save the family name, to keep the ranch standing another day, he gave away the one thing he valued most, the very flesh and blood of his lineage. She was promised, not out of love, but out of necessity, her destiny traded like cattle on the market. The town whispered of her fate, some with pity, others with scorn. A girl so young, so full of life, now bound by a choice she never made. To many, it seemed like the end of her story, as though her voice had been silenced and her will broken. Yet, the Old West has always been a land where fate twists in the blink of an eye, where one unexpected rider on the horizon could change everything. And on that day, when hope seemed buried in dust and despair, the horizon revealed something no one could have imagined. From the edge of the prairie rode a figure that struck fear and awe into every settler who laid eyes upon him. A giant of a man, a Comanche warrior whose very presence silenced conversations and stilled the restless winds. His reputation stretched farther than the rivers and mountains, whispered in fear around campfires. But what stunned the town in his silence was not his might, nor his legend. It was his claim. With eyes fierce and unyielding, he spoke words that shattered the chains of her unwanted fate. He would take her hand, not as property, but as his chosen. In that single moment, the story of a rancher's daughter shifted from sorrow to something far greater. Her life was no longer bound by debts and despair, but by a destiny she could not have foreseen. What began as a tale of loss was about to become a story of defiance, passion, and survival in the unforgiving wilderness of the West. And as the dust rose behind the Comanche's horse, the hearts of all who watched knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The rancher's daughter felt her world collapse as the deal was struck. Her father's trembling hands sealed her fate, and though he looked away, she could still see the shame in his eyes. That night, the house was quiet except for the sound of the prairie winds brushing against the wooden walls. She pressed her face into the pillow, her tears mingling with dust, wondering if this would be the last night she would belong to herself. The Old West was merciless, and she now bore its cruelest truth. Freedom could vanish with a single desperate bargain. At dawn, the girl walked out to the corral, her bare feet pressing into the cold earth. The cattle stood thin and weak, ribs jutting against their hides, as if mocking her family's struggle. She placed a hand on the worn wood of the fence, her mind caught between duty and despair. She had always believed the ranch was more than land and cattle. It was her heritage, her blood, but now it felt like a prison tightening around her. Each breath carried the weight of sacrifice, yet deep inside her chest burned a defiant spark that refused to die. The townsfolk gossiped as the news spread. Some pitied her, whispering behind closed doors about how unfair life had been. Others spoke with cruel tongues, saying it was only fitting for a poor rancher's daughter to be given away like chattel. Their words cut deep, and though she held her chin high, each glance reminded her that she was no longer seen as a young woman with a future, but as a transaction. It was the cruel arithmetic of survival. One life weighed against another. Her father, once a proud man who had ridden against storms and bandits, now sat at the edge of the porch, his shoulders bent like a broken tree. He had traded her hand not out of malice, but out of a desperate love to keep what little they had from being swallowed whole. Yet love could not erase the betrayal she felt, nor could it soothe the ache in her chest. The daughter understood his reasons, but understanding did not lessen the wound. Then, as the sun fell behind the horizon and the prairie skies turned red, a distant figure appeared. The earth seemed to tremble under the hooves of his horse, and whispers of his name traveled faster than the wind. A giant Comanche warrior, a man whose shadow seemed to stretch across the plains, rode toward the ranch. His presence was like a storm arriving without warning, and with him came a destiny that none could have imagined. The Comanche dismounted with a grace that contradicted his size, his frame towering over every settler who dared meet his gaze. Silence spread across the gathered crowd, as if even the wind held its breath. The warrior's eyes were dark, sharp as an eagle's, yet there was no malice in them, only certainty. He looked at the rancher's daughter, and in that gaze, she felt something she had not known in months, the stirring of possibility. The rancher stepped forward, his voice trembling as he demanded to know the warrior's purpose. But his words faltered the moment the Comanche spoke. In a low, steady voice, the warrior declared that the girl would not be handed over to any man by force or debt. Instead, he claimed her hand as his own, not as property, but as one who had chosen. Gasps rippled through the crowd, for never had a settler's daughter been spoken for in such a way, and never by a Comanche of such renown. The daughter's heart thundered in her chest. Fear and hope collided within her, for this claim could mean salvation or ruin. She had heard the stories of the Comanche, their raids, their battles, their legends sung in blood and fire. Yet the man before her was not the savage described in whispers. He was powerful, yes, but his words carried honor, and in his voice she sensed protection rather than threat. The world she had known was crumbling, yet for the first time, she glimpsed the outline of a new path. The townsfolk murmured, torn between outrage and awe. Some called it blasphemy, demanding the girl be left to her rightful fate. Others, quietly, wondered if the warrior's claim was not a curse but a blessing, a shield from the shame and despair that had hung over the ranch. Old men shook their heads, unable to reconcile their prejudice with the reality before them, while young women watched with wide eyes, daring to imagine that destiny could be rewritten in a single moment. As the sky darkened, the Comanche extended his hand toward the girl. Every eye was fixed on her, waiting to see if she would recoil or step forward. Her chest rose and fell as she drew a breath heavy with fear, courage, and longing. The Old West had given her little choice, but now, standing before this man who had defied both settlers and warriors alike, she realized that perhaps, for the first time, her choice truly mattered. The girl hesitated only for a heartbeat before she placed her hand into his. A silence fell over the crowd, one so deep it seemed the prairie itself was holding its breath. Her palm, small and trembling, was engulfed by the warrior's calloused hand, steady and unshakable. In that simple act, everything shifted. The daughter was no longer a bargaining piece, no longer a victim of debt and despair. She was now tied to a force far greater than her father's failing ranch or the cruel whispers of the town. Her father's face tightened with conflict, shame burning across his features. He had made his choice to save the land, but now another choice had been made for him, one he could not control. His lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. How could he, when the warrior's presence carried the weight of inevitability? He was a man crushed by drought and failure, and though he wanted to object, deep inside he knew he no longer held the power to dictate the future. The daughter's heart pounded as the warrior led her a step away from the crowd. Her pulse raced with fear, but alongside it bloomed an unfamiliar sensation, strength. She was terrified, yet she felt more alive than she had in months. The whispers around her blurred into nothingness as she dared to glance up into his eyes. They were fierce, yes, but they were not cold. She could see that this man carried stories deeper than scars, and something in his silence spoke louder than any promise. The crowd's unrest grew. Settlers shifted uneasily, some raising their voices against what they called an abomination. To them, the line between rancher and warrior, settler and Comanche, was carved in stone. Yet others could not help but be captivated. They saw in this moment not a scandal, but a story, the kind of tale the West was built upon, of unexpected alliances, of defiance in the face of despair, of destiny rewriting itself in dust and fire. As the last light of day painted the horizon in crimson, the warrior, mounted his horse once more. He lifted her effortlessly, placing her before him on the saddle. The crowd gasped, her father staggered, and the daughter's world tilted into a storm of uncertainty. But as the horse surged forward into the open plains, her tears were no longer of despair. For the first time, she felt as though she were not being given away, but being carried towards something unknown, something fierce, and something undeniably hers. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, the wind whipping through her hair as the horse raced across the open land. Behind them, the ranch faded into the distance, along with the weight of her father's decision. She clung to the warrior's side, not out of fear of falling, but because the rhythm of his heartbeat against her back anchored her in a world spinning out of control. The horizon stretched like a promise, vast and unforgiving, yet filled with possibilities her old life could never have offered. Night fell, and the stars glittered above with a brilliance only the Old West could reveal. They stopped at a clearing, where the warrior built a fire with swift precision. The daughter sat in silence, her mind a storm of questions. Who was he truly? Why had he chosen her, a rancher's daughter with nothing to offer? She dared not speak, but her eyes searched his every movement, trying to read the story etched in the lines of his face and the scars across his arms. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of countless battles and hardships. He told her that he had seen too many lives stolen by greed, too many women traded as property, too many hearts broken under the cruel law of survival. He would not allow her to share the same fate. His words were not adorned with poetry or charm, but they struck deeper than any declaration of love. In them, she heard not just protection, but defiance against a world that sought to crush the vulnerable. Her eyes filled with tears as she listened, the firelight reflecting in their glimmer. For the first time, she felt seen, not as a burden, not as a commodity, but as a soul worth guarding. She whispered her fears into the night, her voice fragile yet unbroken, telling him of the shame, the betrayal, and the hopelessness that had bound her for so long. He listened without interruption, his silence a sanctuary where her words could finally breathe. As the flames crackled and the night grew colder, she realized that the bond forming between them was not built on force or bargain, but on choice. She had been taken from her father's ranch, not as cattle traded, but as a woman claimed with honor. And though the road ahead was uncertain, the daughter of a struggling rancher felt something stir in her chest once more. Hope, fierce and unyielding, like the prairie winds themselves. Dawn crept over the plains, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose. The girl stirred awake by the fire, the warrior already standing watch like a sentinel carved from stone. He had not spoken much after their exchange the night before, but his silence was not heavy with distance. Instead, it carried the weight of vigilance, as if he bore her safety as his sole burden. For the first time, she realized she was no longer trapped in a cage of despair. She was walking into a destiny untamed, as wild and uncertain as the land itself. As they continued their ride, the prairie revealed both its beauty and its dangers. Herds of buffalo thundered in the distance, their strength shaking the earth beneath her. Coyotes howled at the edge of the horizon, their cries haunting yet strangely fitting to the untamed song of the West. She clung tightly to the warrior, her fear tempered by the strange comfort of his presence. He was a man feared by settlers and revered by his own, and now he was her shield against the world. The journey was not without peril. Midday, they crossed paths with a band of rough men, drifters who lived by plunder and cruelty. Their eyes leered at her, their laughter echoing with mockery. Yet before they could approach, the Comanche's presence alone froze them in place. He did not reach for his weapon, nor raise his voice. His sheer stature, the unspoken legend carried in every scar and sinew, was enough to make the men retreat into the shadows. In that moment, she saw not just a warrior, but a force of nature, an immovable storm. Her heart swelled with gratitude, but also with something she could not yet name. This was not the life she had envisioned, nor the one she had been raised to expect. Yet the further she rode with him, the more the shackles of shame and sorrow fell away. For every mile that carried her farther from the ranch, she began to feel a strange sense of freedom, as if her old self were being shed like an old skin left behind in the dust. That night, under a canopy of stars, the daughter dared to smile. The prairie winds sang through the grass, carrying whispers of a life she could not yet see, but was beginning to believe in. She no longer felt like the girl who had been given away. She felt like a woman standing at the edge of something vast and powerful, her spirit tethered not by chains of debt, but by the promise of a future she was just beginning to glimpse. The days stretched on, each sunrise weaving a new thread into the fabric of her fate. The girl began to notice details she had once overlooked: the quiet respect in the warrior's gestures, the way he always placed himself between her and danger, the patience with which he listened to her stories of the ranch, of her father, and of the life she had lost. The silence that once intimidated her now felt like a fortress, a space where she could breathe without fear of judgment. Yet, her heart was not free of conflict. At night, when sleep eluded her, memories of her father's weary face haunted her thoughts. She knew he had not given her away out of hatred, but out of desperation. And though she now found strength in her new path, guilt lingered like a shadow. She wondered if her father cursed himself each night, wondering what had become of her. That duality, freedom and sorrow, wove itself into every heartbeat. The warrior, sensing her turmoil, began to share fragments of his own story. He spoke of battles fought, of kin lost to wars and hunger, of a people forced to survive against the tide of settlers pressing deeper into their lands. His words carried grief, but also resilience. In his story, she found a mirror to her own: two lives marked by loss, bound by the harsh justice of the West, yet refusing to surrender to despair. Their pain was different, but their fight was the same. With each passing day, the girl's strength grew. She learned to ride with him not as a passenger, but as one who belonged to the endless horizon. She gathered firewood, tended to the flames, and began to speak with a confidence she had thought lost. The prairie, once terrifying in its vastness, now seemed like an ally, wild, untamed, but filled with hidden promise. Her fear was no longer of what lay ahead, but of who she might become if she dared to embrace it. And so, under the relentless sun and the sweeping skies, the bond between rancher's daughter and Comanche warrior deepened. It was not spoken in words of romance, nor carved into vows, but written in silence, in survival, and in the unshakable knowledge that their fates were now intertwined. The West had tried to break them both, but together they were beginning to write a story neither had expected, one that whispered of defiance, strength, and an unyielding hope that no storm could erase. The prairie tested them as the days grew harsher, its beauty masking the dangers that lurked within. A sudden storm swept across the plains one evening, its winds howling like furious spirits. The girl clung to the warrior as the horse battled against the gusts, rain slicing across their faces like shards of glass. The earth turned to mud beneath the hooves, threatening to swallow them whole. Yet through the chaos, the warrior's steady hand never wavered, guiding her safely to a ridge where they found shelter beneath a cluster of jagged rocks. In that refuge, soaked and trembling, she realized something profound. Her old life had been filled with quiet suffering, with despair hidden beneath walls of duty. But here, amid storms and uncertainty, she felt alive in a way she never had before. Every breath was a battle, every heartbeat a triumph. She was no longer a girl bound by chains. She was a woman tempered by fire and wind, forged into something stronger than the past she had left behind. When dawn returned, the land seemed reborn, cleansed by the storm's fury. The prairie stretched before them, glistening with dew, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. The warrior stood tall against the rising sun, his figure a silhouette of resilience. She watched him in silence, and for the first time, admiration grew into something deeper, something unspoken yet undeniable. It wasn't gratitude alone. It was trust, fierce and consuming, born not from words, but from survival shared side by side. The journey brought them to a riverbank, its waters wide and restless. Crossing it would mean risk, yet the warrior faced it without hesitation. The girl followed, her hands trembling as she clutched the reins, but she steadied herself with the thought that she was not alone. Together they guided the horse through the torrent, the cold water rising to her waist. Fear clawed at her chest, but the warrior's calm presence carried her across, each step defying the current that sought to drag them under. On the other side, drenched and shivering, she laughed, a sound that startled even herself. It was the laughter of someone who had stared into danger and come out stronger. The warrior looked at her, his stern expression softening for just a moment, and in his silence, she knew he heard the meaning behind that laugh. It was the sound of a spirit unbroken, a promise that she would no longer bow to despair. Their journey soon carried them into the heart of Comanche territory, a land alive with stories carved into every hill and shadow. The girl felt the weight of countless eyes watching her, the people of the warrior measuring her worth with silent stares. Whispers rippled through the camp as they arrived, some voices filled with suspicion, others with awe. For a rancher's daughter to stand at the side of a Comanche giant was a sight no one had ever imagined. The girl's heart pounded as she dismounted, every step heavier than the last. She felt the weight of their judgment pressing against her, yet she refused to lower her gaze. Though her hands trembled, she remembered the storms, the rivers, the long nights beneath endless stars. She was no longer the frightened daughter given away by her father. She was a woman who had walked beside danger and lived. With her chin lifted, she faced the camp not as a captive, but as one who belonged. The warrior spoke to his people, his voice carrying authority that silenced the murmurs. He told them of her courage, of the fire he had seen in her spirit, of how she had chosen to place her hand in his. Some nodded with respect, others with doubt, but none could deny the conviction in his words. His claim was not of dominance, but of honor, and in that truth, the girl found her own strength reflected back to her. The elders, their faces carved with the wisdom of countless seasons, gathered to study her. Their eyes were sharp, searching for weakness, but what they saw instead was resilience. She did not hide her fear, she carried it openly, and in doing so, she revealed the courage that lay beneath. The elders exchanged glances, their silence heavy with meaning, as though even they could sense that fate had woven something greater into this union. That night, as fires burned across the camp, the girl sat among the people who had once been spoken of to her only as enemies. The flames danced against their faces, their songs rising into the sky like prayers to the stars. She felt the weight of history pressing upon her, the clash of two worlds bound by mistrust. Yet in that moment, she understood. Her story was no longer one of shame or despair. It was a story of defiance, of survival, of a bond that challenged the very boundaries of the Old West itself. The days in the Comanche camp revealed trials the girl had never faced before. She was tested not with words, but with silent judgments, each glance a measure of her strength. Women of the tribe watched her carefully, their eyes weighing whether she would falter or stand tall. She stumbled at times, burning her hands while tending to the fire, spilling water while learning to carry the heavy skins. But never once did she retreat into despair. Every mistake became a lesson, every failure a step toward resilience. The warrior remained near, yet never interfered. He allowed her to fall, to rise, to prove herself. His silence was not neglect, but trust, a quiet acknowledgement that she was capable of forging her own path. At night, when the fire dimmed and shadows stretched across the camp, he would sit beside her. No grand speeches passed between them, only fragments of stories, small pieces of his life revealed like stones laid upon a path. And in turn, she found herself sharing her own truths, the pain of betrayal, the quiet ache of her father's sacrifice, and the fear that still lingered in her chest. Slowly, the people began to shift in their regard. Where once they saw an outsider, now they saw a spirit unyielding, one that bent but did not break. Children came first, drawn by her gentleness, her willingness to laugh despite her struggles. Then came the women, who saw in her not a rival, but a survivor, a woman who carried scars as they did. Acceptance was not swift, but it was real, and each nod of approval from the tribe felt like a victory carved into her soul. the girl began to notice how different her life had become. Back at the ranch, each day had been defined by limits. What she could not do, what she could not be. Here, each day was a test, but also an opportunity. She learned to ride bareback, to weave leather into ropes, to gather herbs that healed wounds. The prairie was no longer a cage. It was a teacher. Each lesson hardened her spirit, sharpening the edges dulled by years of quiet suffering. And through it all, she began to feel the unspoken bond between her and the warrior deepen. It was not marked by tender words or stolen glances, but by the way he always stood near when she faltered, the way his silence gave her room to grow, the way his gaze met hers and told her without a word that she was no longer alone. Their connection was not a fragile flame. It was fire forged in storms, battles, and survival, a fire that even the cruel winds of the West could not extinguish. Whispers of their union spread beyond the camp, carried on the winds to nearby settlements and rival tribes. Some settlers cursed her name, branding her as lost, a traitor to her blood. Others whispered tales of defiance, of a rancher's daughter who rose from despair to stand beside a Comanche giant. The story grew with each retelling, becoming legend even before it was fully lived. Yet within the camp, the girl did not think of herself as legend. She was simply living, fighting, and choosing each day to step forward instead of falling back. One evening, the elders called upon the warrior and the girl to stand before the council fire. Flames leapt high, casting long shadows across the circle of faces. The air was heavy with tension, as if the very spirits of the land had gathered to bear witness. The eldest among them spoke, their voices slow and measured, declaring that this union would not only shape two lives, but might alter the fragile balance between worlds, settler and Comanche, ranch and prairie, despair and hope. The girl's heart thundered as the elder's words sank deep. She looked around the circle, at faces both skeptical and accepting, and felt the full weight of what her journey had become. She was no longer just her father's daughter. She was no longer the girl given away in a desperate bargain. She was a woman standing at the threshold of two worlds, carrying within her the courage to bridge them. Her breath caught as she realized the truth. Her story was not merely about survival. It was about transformation. The warrior stood beside her, silent but resolute, his presence steady as the earth beneath her feet. When the elder asked if she would choose this path freely, she did not hesitate. Her voice, steady and strong, rose above the crackling fire as she declared her choice. It was not forced upon her, not bargained, but spoken from her own heart. In that moment, her fate was no longer dictated by debt or despair. It was shaped by her own defiance, her own will, her own fire. As the council fire blazed higher, the people let out cries that echoed into the night. Some voices carried doubt, others pride, but the flames did not waver. And in the glow of that fire, the girl stood taller than she ever had, her hand once more in the warrior's. The rancher's daughter who had been given away was gone. In her place stood a woman reborn in the heart of the Old West, a woman claimed not by chains of necessity, but by the fierce and untamed spirit of destiny itself. The story of the rancher's daughter and the Comanche warrior was not just about survival. It was about transformation. What began in despair, with a girl given away like cattle, ended with her standing tall in the firelight of a new destiny. Her journey showed that even in the harshest corners of the Old West, where storms and battles raged without mercy, the human spirit could still carve out hope, strength, and belonging. Her father's decision had been born of desperation, yet it set in motion a path neither of them could have foreseen. She was no longer defined by the shame of being bartered away, but by the courage she discovered within herself. And through the warrior's silent strength, she found not chains, but freedom. In their bond, the Old West revealed one of its greatest truths, that love and honor could rise even from the ashes of sorrow. The whispers of townsfolk and elders could not silence the truth of her choice. She had embraced a new life, not as a victim, but as a woman who defied despair. Her story became a reflection of the West itself, wild, dangerous, unforgiving, yet filled with the power to shape legends. Each hardship she faced became not a mark of weakness, but proof that resilience thrives even when the world tries to crush it. The lesson of her journey is one that lingers. Destiny is not always chosen for us by fathers, by debts, or by the judgment of others. Sometimes it rides in from the horizon, fierce and untamed, demanding that we rise to meet it. And when we do, we discover that we are far stronger than we ever believed. If this story moved you, let's stay with you. Reflect on the power of resilience, on the courage to embrace what others may fear, and on the strength found in unexpected bonds. And if you want to continue walking through tales as powerful and unforgettable as this one, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice keeps these stories alive, echoing across the vast frontier of the Old West and beyond.